Elias Carter wasn't one to seek attention. He lived alone in his modest home on a quiet street in Crescent Ridge, a sleepy neighborhood tucked on the edge of the city. He worked as a freelance graphic designer, spending most of his days indoors. His life punctuated only by brief interactions with his neighbors, mostly nods and waves, the occasional exchange about yard work or the weather. He was a quiet man, proud of his routine, proud of his privacy. The biggest issue he had lately was the Wi-Fi. It had been acting up, getting slower by the day, disconnecting at odd times. Annoyed, but not too concerned, he assumed it was just a glitch with his service provider. But when it didn't get better, he decided to investigate. It started on a Thursday morning. Elias had been up late the night before, finishing up a few design mock-ups for a client. He hadn't slept much, so after his morning coffee, he decided to take a short break before diving back into his work. His fingers lazily tapped to the screen of his phone as he went into his router settings. Nothing seemed too out of the ordinary until he spotted it. A device was connected to his network. It wasn't just any device. Its name stood out. Crescent Ridge I-01. It was strange because Elias knew exactly what was connected to his Wi-Fi. His laptop, phone, and occasionally his TV, but nothing else. He hadn't given out the password to anyone, nor did he have roommates or visitors who would use his connection. This was something or someone new. His brow furrowed. The name felt odd, too specific, almost like it was meant to be noticed. Without thinking, Elias quickly removed the device from his network and reset his password, taking care to choose a new one. Longer, more complex, harder to guess. He stood up from his desk and walked outside to get a stronger signal, leaning against the porch railing while he typed the new password into his phone. It was a calm morning, with a light breeze, the kind of day that almost felt like it could last forever. But from the corner of his eye, he noticed movement. Across the street, through the kitchen window of the house next door, Melanie Foster was watching him. Elias had always thought of her as a bit of a busybody, though he didn't have any real proof. She was the type of neighbor who kept an eye on everyone, especially the quiet ones like him. Elias didn't think much of it at first. People were curious. But when he saw her pick up her phone, his unease grew. Moments later, he heard sirens. At first, he didn't register the sound. Maybe they were headed elsewhere. But when a squad car stopped right in front of his house, Elias' heart skipped a beat. 2 officers stepped out. One was tall, broad-shouldered, with a no-nonsense air. Detective Trent Sullivan. His partner was a woman, her posture straight, sharp, carrying an aura of quiet authority. Officer Mia Carter. Elias stood still, his breath slowing as they approached. He couldn't help but wonder what was going on. Was this some mistake? Or had something serious been reported? Sullivan, the detective said, voice low but firm. We received a call about suspicious activity. What's going on here? Elias didn't move at first. The officer's eyes scanned him, their presence intimidating despite their professionalism. He was caught off guard. He wasn't doing anything unusual. He'd simply been changing his Wi-Fi password. Was that something worth calling the police over? I'm just updating my Wi-Fi settings, Elias replied, his voice steady. But there was an edge of confusion. I noticed some unknown devices connected to my network. I'm just taking care of it. Sullivan's eyes narrowed as he exchanged a glance with Officer Carter. Is that right? Sullivan asked, tone skeptical. You live here then? Elias almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. Of course, he lived here. His car was parked in the driveway. His name was on the mailbox. It didn't make sense. Yes, I've lived here for 3 years, Elias replied, crossing his arms. Before Sullivan could respond, a voice called out from across the street. That's not true. He's always up to something strange. Elias looked over in surprise. There was Melanie Foster, standing on her porch, arms crossed, her eyes fixed on him. He's always out there, poking around with his phone, staring at people like he's watching them, she continued, her voice rising with each word. Now he's messing with his Wi-Fi password like some hacker. Elias blinked, trying to process what she was saying. He hadn't been doing anything out of the ordinary. Was this really happening? Melanie had been suspicious of him for as long as he could remember, but this was next level. Sullivan looked at Melanie with a questioning gaze. "Ma'am, do you have any evidence that Mr. Carter has done something illegal?" he asked. Melanie hesitated. I just have a feeling," she stammered, unwilling to back down. Sullivan sighed, clearly frustrated but maintaining his composure. He turned back to Elias. "We just need to check your router settings, sir." To clear things up, Elias clenched his jaw. This wasn't right. He shouldn't have to prove anything. But he knew better than to argue. Not with the police standing here. Not with Melanie clearly convinced he was up to something. "Fine," he muttered, unlocking his phone and opening the settings. The officers stepped closer, their eyes scanning the screen. Sullivan leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "What's this?" he asked. The name of the device stood out again. *** Crescent Ridge, I01***. It didn't belong to Elias. He was sure of it. But who did it belong to? Elias ran his fingers over the screen. "I don't know," he said quietly. "But someone's been using my Wi-Fi without permission." Suddenly, everything changed. Sullivan's posture shifted, his face hardening. "Someone's been accessing your network," he said, his voice now filled with something more serious. "And they may be spying on you." Melanie took a step back, visibly uncomfortable. "What do you mean spying?" she asked, her voice wavering. Elias turned to her, his face cold. "It means someone might be watching you, watching all of us," he said. A long silence filled the space between them, heavy and unnerving. It was one thing to think someone had stolen his Wi-Fi. It was another to think they had been watching him. And worse, watching everyone else in the neighborhood. The air in Elias's living room felt thick as Detective Sullivan and Officer Carter hovered over his laptop, their eyes scanning the screen with an intensity that made Elias's stomach churn. He had hoped that his worst fears wouldn't be confirmed, but as he clicked through the logs, the truth was slowly unfolding in front of him. The name Crescent Ridge, I01 still appeared, still connected, still active. The device was clearly using his Wi-Fi. But what was more unsettling was what it had been doing. "I don't understand," Elias muttered under his breath, clicking on the activity log. "It's been running nonstop. Whoever's using it has been active for hours, possibly days." His fingers hovered over the screen, scrolling through lines of data. The more he saw, the more his chest tightened. "They've been watching something." Sullivan's brows furrowed. "Watching what?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Elias's fingers shook as he navigated through the logs. He opened the security camera feed on his laptop, the little icons showing active feeds from all corners of his house. He knew exactly which ones had been accessed. "Someone's been logging into my cameras," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I'd been safe. But they've been watching every room, every corner. They know everything about my house." Sullivan's jaw tightened. He glanced at Officer Carter, who had been quietly scanning the room, her hand still resting near her gun. "We need to know who's doing this," Sullivan said, his voice more serious now. "If they've been watching you, they could be watching others, too." Elias nodded, his heart hammering in his chest. He didn't need to look at Melanie, who was still standing at the door, her hands trembling. He could feel her eyes on him, filled with a mix of confusion and fear. She hadn't expected this. No one had. "Detective, this isn't just about me," Elias continued, turning back to the laptop. "This system has flagged multiple IP addresses. Some of them belong to devices in the neighborhood. Not just mine. Someone's been tapping into more than one home, more than one security system." Officer Carter's expression darkened as she stepped closer to the screen. "You mean it's not just your cameras? This person has been accessing cameras all over Crescent Ridge." "Exactly," Elias said, his throat dry. "I thought it was just my feed at first. But it's not. There are others." Melanie's eyes widened in disbelief. She took a slow step back, as though the walls around her were closing in. No, that can't be right," she whispered. "Who would do that?" Elias didn't know who would, but he knew this wasn't an accident. It wasn't just some random thief stealing bandwidth or using his Wi-Fi as a free service. No, this felt intentional. Someone was watching, collecting information, and they had been doing it for a while. "Do you have a way to trace where this data is being sent?" Officer Carter asked, breaking the tense silence. Elias nodded. I can track the IP addresses. I've done some network security work in the past. If I dig a little deeper, I can figure out where it's all going. Then do it, Sullivan said sharply. We need to find out who's behind this. Elias took a deep breath and got to work, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he cross-referenced IP addresses, looking for any hint of a lead. His pulse quickened as he opened a new set of logs, scanning for any clues about where the data was being sent. He tapped a few commands and then froze. Wait, he whispered. This can't be right. Sullivan leaned over his shoulder, his gaze narrowing. What is it? Elias pointed to the screen, his finger trembling. The data isn't going to some random server or some cloud storage. It's being sent to an address in the neighborhood. Which address? Sullivan asked, his voice now tinged with urgency. Elias quickly cross-referenced the timestamps of the data logs with the signal strength of each device. It didn't take long before he had a match. His stomach dropped. It's coming from a house just a few doors down, Elias said, his voice barely a whisper. Melanie's face drained of color. You mean someone in the neighborhood is behind this? She asked, her voice cracking. Who? Elias's eyes flicked between her and the laptop screen. I can pinpoint exactly which house. He swallowed hard. It's Brandon's house. There was a long, stunned silence. Brandon. Melanie's voice was barely a whisper, like the words had caught in her throat. Elias nodded grimly. Brandon Foster. Your nephew. The shock on Melanie's face was almost painful to watch. Her breath hitched as she stumbled backward. No, it can't be. He wouldn't do something like this. Sullivan exchanged a look with Officer Carter, who was still processing the new information. It's coming from his IP address, Sullivan said, his voice calm but deadly serious. That's who's behind this. Elias could see the struggle in Melanie's eyes. She wanted to deny it, to believe that there was some mistake, but deep down she knew. Elias could see it in her face. She recognized the truth. Melanie's voice shook as she finally spoke. No, he couldn't. I've known him since he was a little boy. He's always been quiet, kept to himself. He's not the kind of person who'd do this. Elias didn't respond. He understood her denial, but the evidence was in front of them. All of it. They had no choice now but to confront Brandon. I'll take you there, Melanie said, her voice a mixture of dread and resolve. But I swear I don't know how this happened. I don't believe it. You don't have to believe it, Elias said flatly. We just need to stop him before it goes any further. The car ride to the station was silent, heavy with the weight of the truth. Brandon sat in the back of the patrol car, his head hung low, his body slumped as though he had already resigned himself to his fate. Melanie, sitting in the passenger seat, couldn't bring herself to speak. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, shock, disbelief, shame. She had trusted him. She had believed in him. How could she have missed the signs? How could she have been so blind? Elias sat in the front, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed straight ahead. He hadn't spoken much since the arrest, too absorbed in his own thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, the entire neighborhood had been complicit in this twisted game. How many others had turned a blind eye to the quiet young man who never seemed to connect with anyone? How many others had failed to notice the subtle signs of something darker lurking beneath the surface? When they reached the station, Brandon was processed, his fate now in the hands of the justice system. Melanie watched from the other side of the room, her heart breaking with every step he took toward the holding cell. This wasn't the future she had envisioned for him. This wasn't the life she had hoped he would build. The boy she had cared for, treated like a son, was now facing criminal charges that could alter the course of his life forever. Melanie, Elias said, his voice calm but firm, snapping her out of her trance. This isn't your fault. She looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. I should have seen it. I should have known. Her voice was barely a whisper, as though saying it out loud made it all the more real. I let him in. I gave him everything. And this is how he repays me. You couldn't have known, Elias replied, his gaze softening. People don't show their true selves until it's too late. You trusted him because you wanted to believe the best. You didn't fail him, he failed you. His words were meant to comfort, but they felt hollow to Melanie. She still couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of guilt that washed over her. She had failed her own instincts. She had failed her neighbors, too. Sullivan entered the room, his presence a somber reminder of the harsh reality. Brandon is officially booked. We're pushing for the full extent of the charges, but with his cooperation, there's a chance he might get a reduced sentence. Melanie barely registered his words. She nodded numbly, not sure what she was even agreeing to. She had no idea how to navigate this situation, how to make sense of the mess her nephew had created. She couldn't even begin to think about the future. "Can we see him?" she finally asked, her voice breaking. She needed to speak to him, to hear his side of the story, even if it made her heart ache more. Sullivan hesitated, glancing at Elias. "I'll make sure you get a chance. But don't expect him to be cooperative. He's in shock right now, but the weight of what he's done is sinking in. It's up to him whether he wants to say anything to you." Melanie nodded, wiping her tears away with the back of her hand. She didn't know what she wanted from him, but she needed to face the reality of what had happened. She couldn't run from it, no matter how painful it was. A few minutes later, Brandon was escorted into the interview room, his hands still cuffed, but his eyes hollow, void of the defiance he had shown earlier. He didn't look like the same person who had walked into the house just days ago. The playful, mischievous young man she had once known was gone, replaced by someone unrecognizable. Someone lost. "Brandon," Melanie began, her voice strained as she tried to keep her composure. "How could you do this? To me, to all of us." Brandon's eyes flickered toward her, but he said nothing at first. He seemed so small, so vulnerable, that for a moment she almost couldn't believe this was the same person who had been hiding behind the screen, watching her every move. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," Brandon finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never thought it would go this far." "I trusted you," Melanie said, her words cutting through the silence. "I gave you everything, my home, my family, and you used that trust to hurt us, to invade our privacy. You betrayed me." "I didn't mean to," Brandon repeated, his voice cracking. "I was curious. I didn't know what I was doing. At first, it was just messing with the Wi-Fi, like a stupid prank. But then, his voice trailed off, the weight of his actions finally hitting him. But then it felt like something more. I couldn't stop." Melanie's heart broke for the boy she had once believed in. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a young man who had gotten lost along the way, too far gone to find his way back. "I don't know what I was thinking," Brandon whispered, his head dropping. "I'm so sorry, Aunt Melanie. I didn't mean to destroy everything." Tears welled in Melanie's eyes once again, but she didn't let them fall. She had to be strong. She had to be the one who kept it together. "You've ruined everything, Brandon. And now we all have to live with the consequences." Brandon's shoulders trembled, and for the first time since the arrest, he broke down. His sobs echoed in the small room, and Melanie felt a pang of sympathy, but it wasn't enough to erase the damage he had done. Sullivan's voice broke the tension. "That's enough for now. We'll give you some space." As they left the room, Melanie looked back at her nephew, sitting in that cold chair, his face a mask of guilt and regret. It didn't matter now. The damage was done. There was no going back. Outside, Elias spoke quietly. "I know this is hard, but you're not alone. The neighborhood is with you. And so am I." Melanie gave him a small, grateful smile, her eyes still red. "Thank you." But even as she walked away from the station, she knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The damage was deep. And while Brandon might never be the person she thought he was, she hoped, somehow, that he could find redemption, if not for her, then for himself.